Welcome to A Future Date. My name is Castro, and I'm a certified digital accessibility specialist with more than 20 years experience using Adobe InDesign. My presentation today is on advanced Adobe InDesign techniques for richer AT experience. And AT experience stands for assistive technology. So the goal of today's presentation is to give you some advanced tips and techniques that you can use using Adobe InDesign when you're creating infographics and other graphics so that people using screen readers or other assistive technology can digest them easier and get more information from them. So if you're in the accessibility space or you just want to make clearer infographics, stick around because I've got some tips to show you. Let's dive right in. All right, so the first thing you want to do is get a plan. Usually an infographic is not a standalone piece, but it's part of a bigger project. So if we take a look at this little flowchart here, we have our overall graphic style and color. So that's one of the first things that you want to detail out. You want to make sure you have a good understanding about what style and what colors you're going to use. You want to use a color palette that's going to be colorblind friendly. You're going to want to make sure that you have a nice high contrast, and you want to make sure that your overall style is well thought out, because there's nothing worse than getting into a document and then finding out halfway through that you didn't think how the document was going to flow together. The next thing you want to concern yourself with are the images, charts, and graphs. They're going to take the most work. They're going to take the most thought. So as you start laying out your document, identify where those images and infographics and charts are going to be so that as you hand them off to your team or you start your storyboarding, it all kind of starts to flow together and you're able to start walking through some of those accessibility questions you need to ask yourself, like, is this the best way to present this information? Are we supporting our charts and graphs with body text? Those types of things. The next thing you want to be concerned about are your tables. Are your tables going to be spanning multiple pages? Are you using them simply as a layout object to lay out text on a page? Do your tables make logical sense? Do you have merge cells in them that are going to create a difficult user experience or a difficult experience for you when you're trying to make them accessible? And of course, finally, the text content. And text really is pretty easy because really we're concerned with heading structure, lists, and making sure that we have a good flow, that we're supporting our infographics and our tables, that we've got nice headings and captions. All of those things are pretty low-hanging fruit. The thing that is most intriguing is people's approach to infographics. And sometimes they take a really great approach, and other times there's a lot to be said for what they can do to improve them. Once you identify all the pieces and parts of your document, then you start going through changes and revisions. You'll create your accessible PDF draft and start working through some of the issues there. Then you'll go through it and you'll make your final copy and you'll get it approved and you'll post it, and someone invariably will want to change something. Usually it's something detrimental that's going to change a page number or change the way the document flows, something that's going to require you to go back. So what we want to try to do when we're creating accessible PDFs or accessible documents is when we're in InDesign, we want to do as much as we possibly can in InDesign to make sure that that document is accessible. And especially when we're talking about infographics, we want to make sure that we do as much as we can within the program so that when we get to that PDF stage, we're not having to do a bunch of heavy lifting. All right, let's move to the next slide here. When we talk about infographics, there are three main things we need to consider. One, color and shape. 2, text and context. And 3, read order. We want to make sure that our colors are colorblind friendly, that we're using good enough contrast, and that we're using shapes as well as colors, line styles, and other things to differentiate the different pieces of information. The next thing we want to make sure is that we're supporting our infographics with body text, that we're using text within the document to tell the user what we're hoping they're going to get out of this infographic. There's nothing worse than presenting this super complex infographic where you think they're just going to get it right away and see all these different complex thoughts and ideas, but really you haven't given them enough information. You haven't led them down the road you want them to go. So using context is super important when you're presenting an infographic. And the last one is read order. Read order is important because we want to make sure that we present that infographic in a way that makes sense to the user, right? We want them to be able to read the document easily and not all of a sudden in the middle of a document go down to this other figure and then have to come back. Sometimes that can create a navigation issue with someone who may not be familiar with how to use assistive technology very well. Other times it creates a fragmented experience where they're in the middle of reading a sentence and all of a sudden they get bounced out to an infographic and then they have to hear long alt text and then bounce right back. So typical good practice for presenting infographics and graphics in general is to present them at the beginning of a paragraph or at the end of a paragraph or the end of a section or the beginning of a section, so that you give them a reasonable flow and understandable flow so that they're not having to break in the middle of a sentence and go look at something complex and then come back. So when we talk about color and shape, WCAG has something to say about that. The success criteria 1.4.1 says the use of color is not the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, a prompt or response, or distinguishing a visual element. Now, a lot of these things have to do with HTML, but the one that's most important for us as document designers is distinguishing a visual element. And I think distinguishing is the key point here, because so many people want to take a map or a chart or a graph and say every single piece of that chart or graph has to have a 3:1 color contrast ratio because of non-text contrast rules, or they want to make sure that everything has a bunch of different pattern fills in it. There are ways that you can create infographics elegantly that still comply with the WCAG success criteria that allow you to have some flexibility by the use of labels and the use of line style and the use of being able to identify what the important information is. Remember, this is about the important information in an infographic. So if you're looking at a map, it doesn't mean that every single piece of data on that map has to be explained somehow, or it has to have these crazy color contrast ratios. We're talking about what is the main takeaway you want to give that user when they're looking at your infographic. One of my big pet peeves is colorblind design. We don't think about the 8% on average of male population out there that are colorblind. Now, it's much lower percent, almost 1% in females. And in Black populations, it is very low. And in white populations, it's very high. And that's all around the world. The thing we have to remember is we often use red for closed or don't go this way or danger, and green for open or go this way. And those visual cues are okay for people who can tell the difference between red and green. But if you look at this slide, can you tell me which one's red and green? Can you see in here which ones of these squares have red fills and which ones have green fills? I know I can't, right? So it's super important that as we design, we use context clues other than simply color to differentiate between two different items. So let's take a look at what this chart is supposed to look like. All right, so this looks a lot better, right? We can tell the difference now between the orange and the red and the green and the yellow. Now, although there are colorblind apps out there that will allow you to analyze your images to find out whether or not they're colorblind friendly or how it's going to look in colorblind mode, Adobe Illustrator actually has a colorblind mode built into it. So if we go into Illustrator here and we go up to View and then Proof Setup, we can see that we have color blindness in two different modes. We have protanopia and we have deuteranopia. Now, deuteranopia is the most prevalent color blindness. It's that red-green color blindness that we were talking about earlier, right? So if we turn this on, we can see that immediately we can see that there is no difference between the red and green. They're literally virtually indistinguishable. And honestly, there's no difference between almost no difference between the yellow and the orange. And you can barely see that blue line that's around the outside compared to the gray background, right? So we want to make sure that we use colors that are going to have good contrast and that we're not just using color only. So let's take a look again at the InDesign file and see if we can't make some sense of this format that they were trying to accomplish. So if we look at our legend here, we can see that they have good labeling in that they have a number or a letter inside of their shape, and they're using different shapes, which is great because they're using a text identifier and they're using shape. But then the problem becomes they have A, B, C, D, E, and F, but they're all just different colors. And that's where the problem lies, right? And then if you look at the impact shows that there is a white with a black outline and then a white with a blue outline, but really they probably just meant no outline versus having an outline, right? So let's take a look and see what we can do to fix this. So if we look down here, we can see the first thing we did here is that we added some letters to these items. So if we just add A, and we might have to fix our font size here just slightly so that it fits within there, right? Let's cheat here a little bit just for brevity. So now we have 1A, 2 Well, 2B would be green, right? So we can, this would be 2F, let's just say, right? And 3F, and 4 would be E, right? And we can see here that this white doesn't have enough color contrast against this orange. Now, how do we know that? Well, we use this tool, and it's one of my favorite tools. It's the Color Contrast Analyzer. Now, this tool allows us to use some eyedroppers that overlays on any program out there, so it works great. You don't have to worry about eyedropping and pasting to the web or anything like that. And the way it works is we've got foreground at the top and background at the bottom, and we've got these eyedroppers here. So if we're looking at this orange color, we want to pick our foreground as orange, and then we want to pick our background as white, and it is. And you can see we fail all the way across the board, right? So how do we get a good color contrast? Well, I happen to know that black against orange is definitely higher color contrast. But if we wanted to see what color orange we needed to get a good color contrast, if we could, we can open up these little sliders here and hit synchronize color values and start dragging these left. The problem is that it only goes so far left and we still fail in every one of these ranges. So then sometimes you have to do unsynchronize, and then you start playing with the colors. Like if I go to there, I can kind of get large text to pass, but now we're out of this color range and you can really just drive yourself nuts, right? So if we go back and resample that color, the better way would be to change the text color, right? So what would we need to do? The easiest way would simply be to make this text color black. And then you can see we pass all the way across the board, all the different AA or AAA, we're good to go. So that's the easy lift there, right? So let's go ahead and do that, and we're good to go there. So let's go ahead and check this green. So our background color is green, our foreground color is white, and you can see we pass all but the regular text for AAA, and we're not trying to meet AAA, we're just trying to meet AA, so we're good to go. Now, let's just say I accidentally click the foreground color or the background color. You have this little flip-flop right here. You can click on that little icon, and it will switch from foreground to background, but it doesn't really make a difference. Here it's showing you that there's a text sample and an infographic sample. This tool is a great tool to use. I use it all the time. All right, so now we just need to make this text color black. And we're good to go there. So now we have our text is in line, we have good color contrast, but this background color, the background color we didn't check, and we really should have. So if we look at this orange color as our foreground color and this gray color as our background color, we can see it definitely doesn't pass. So what are we gonna do? Let's go ahead and darken up the background and see if that doesn't help. So let's go ahead and resample this color and then hit synchronize, and then start dragging this left until we start seeing green check marks. And oh, there's one for large text, and there we go. So this is the color. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna copy this without the hashtag right there. And then we are going to go over to our color palette. We're gonna select that little background swatch, double click, and then we're gonna paste that color in, and now we hit OK, and right away you can see it immediately looks much clearer and much more distinct here in the bottom graphic, right? Now, this blue line, is there something we have to do with the blue line? Well, we said color only. Well, the thing here is that there's only one outline. It's either outlined or not outlined. If, let's just say, this other one was a white outline, then we would have to go through and make one of these have a pattern of some sort. So we would make the blue or the white. We could go through and make the white stroke and make it a dash. We could make it a bigger dash or a smaller dash. And now you definitely have color contrast, or another way, another means of differentiating between one stroke and another that isn't color only. So our second means of variation for infographics is text and context, right? And what does WCAG have to say about text? Well, 1.4.5 images of text says, if technology is being used, can achieve the visual presentation text is used to convey information rather than images of text. So what that basically means is if you have the ability to represent text as actual readable text, then you should do that instead of presenting text as images. Now, in an infographic, if the whole thing's a PNG or a JPEG, you have some text on, let's just say a map, for instance, it's going to be an image, right? But that goes back to relevant information. What are we trying to relay? When you're trying to create alt text for a map, or you're trying to think about how this infographic is going to be presented, is there a way that you can walk through that text without it all having to be an image? There is, and we're going to cover that in just a minute. So thank you so much for sticking with me. All right, now on to images of text, right? So what's the definition of images of text? Well, on the left, we've got this great infographic, and we can see here that we've got text inside. Now it looks like a table, but it's actually not. This is a visual graphic that was created, and in here, all of this text happens to be readable, selectable text. So this would not qualify as image of text, but it could if it were an image, a PNG placed inside of a document, which would be probably pretty typical for most of you out there to create an infographic this way, because that's what you've always done. But I'm going to show you a way where you're able to actually allow the user to walk through this data in a better way. So here you can see this other image is an image of a street sign, a construction sign actually, and it has text on it, but it's a photograph of text on a sign. So it's not, it's by definition image of text, but that's where alt text comes in. And so you would create alt text that reads what this sign is if it's relevant. Maybe the text that's on the sign really isn't the relevant part, but it's the idea that there is construction going on in the Central Valley. Right? Now here they have alt text that starts with the word photo, and of course best practices tell us that we should never really start your graphic with the word graphic of or photo of, because it's going to, depending upon your screen reader, announce graphic before or after at the end of the alt text. So unless it's germane like pie chart of or bar graph of, you want them to give, you're trying to give them context as to what it is that you're actually presenting them with, you really should stay away from starting your alt text with the word graphic or photo, because they assume that. All right, now, what does CAG have to say about read order? Well, read order is information and relationships, and that's what CAG Success Criteria 1.3.1, which says information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. In other words, if you're going to have an infographic inside your document, you want it to be logical. You want to have a read order that makes sense. And we talked about where that infographic would sit, right? Do you want it in the middle of the paragraph? So in the middle of a sentence, all of a sudden they're bounced out to this infographic and then bounced back? Probably not. Most of the time you want to finish your thought, or you want to start with, a introductory text that says the following is an infographic of blah, 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 and explains what you're trying to expect the reader to take away from that infographic. So remember, your body text should support your infographic. Now that doesn't mean that your infographic has to be an image or that it has to be a PNG, something flat with just some alt text in it. There are ways to be able to walk through that, and we're going to get there. Right? So how do we get there? We get there with tags, right? So at our disposal, we have quite a few tags that we can use. Now we have document and part and div and all of these container tags that aren't really read by a screen reader. Then of course we've got all our heading levels, and then we've got some inline elements like form or figure. Of course, figure is the one we're most interested in, but not all of these tags are read by screen readers. Right? So the tools that we have to use in InDesign are a little more constricted. So we've got heading levels and figure and link and span and list and all your table stuff. So all of this is kind of at our disposal. So we have to be pretty judicious about how we use the different tags in order to create a good user experience for those using assistive technology, because these tags are going to be how they understand the information and relationships of that information in our document. Now, this is the way, right? Now, what I'm getting ready to show you are some tips and techniques on how to create some infographics, but it is not the only way. There are lots of ways to create graphics that are accessible. And just because I have spoken, because I have said it, doesn't mean it is the only way. I want to reiterate that. There are lots of ways to create accessible infographics. So just take what I'm giving you with a grain of salt, adapt it, use it to be able to think about your process and how your infographic could be made to be something more than just simply a JPEG or a PNG stuck in your document with a piece of alt text on it. Because it doesn't have to be that way. In a large majority of the cases, there are ways around it, but sometimes there's not enough time. Sometimes you can't get buy-in from somebody else to be able to do things like include a table, but there are ways to include a table without having to change your layout at all, and we're gonna cover that as well. All right, so how do we control the flow of information inside our InDesign document? We use anchors and layers, articles and threads, and then we want to talk about labels versus fills. Labels versus fills is a way to answer the success criteria for WCAG that says color cannot be the only means of differentiating. If we include labels in some pretty specific ways, we can get away from having to be forced to add a bunch of dots and slashes and hashes to all of our different fills for things like bar charts and pie charts. So let's take a look at this infographic here. So here we can see that we've got some boxes. We can thread this text. It doesn't have to stay one single image. We can take the background from the image and put it on a different layer so that we can artifact it when it comes that time. And then we're going to thread each of these text boxes so that we start with project visual and initial design, and then step 2, review, step 3, refinement, and on and on. So you're able to give the person using assistive technology the exact text that's in the document, the way it is visually. You don't need to know alt text that says image of right arrow, image of brown right arrow, image of green right arrow. That's inconsequential. The idea is you're walking them through a series of steps. This could be a bulleted list that's styled in a different way. It's up to you. The idea here is that you can separate the graphic element from the text element and present them both, because to the flat user, to the person who's visually digesting this document, it's not going to look any different. But to a person using assistive technology, it's going to be a hugely different experience than to have to sit and listen to alt text. They can sit and actually walk through the data the same way you and I would, which is great. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the articles panel. I'm not sure if many of you have actually even know that this tool is in here. So if you go up to Window and then Articles, it's the very first one, right? So we click on that, and now we have this panel. But what we can do with this panel is so powerful. We can take these items, and we can drag them into the Articles panel in the order that we want them to appear in the tags tree. Now, this doesn't really work very well for 100-page documents or for things that are long publications without a lot of effort. But for single-page flyers or just a couple of pages, this might be the way to go, right? So you can drag these just by simply clicking on and holding down the left mouse button and dragging your text box into the Articles panel and letting go. It's going to ask you, what do I want to call this? And we're going to call this Project Viz, right? And then we're going to hit OK. Now, you can see here in the Articles panel that we've got this name, and it tells you what's underneath there. And I can go ahead, and now I could do this one of a couple of different ways. And the way I would probably do it, since this is all one unified thought, is I would add to that existing item that we've made in the tags tree. So I can grab that the next box and drag it right underneath there and hit and let go. Now it's going to add that second box into my Articles panel. Now we can do the same thing for the third one and drag it right up underneath there and let go. Now, if we were to drag it out into the middle down here underneath our list and let go, it's going to try to ask us for a new item name. That's because we dragged it away from that other list. You want to make sure that when you drag this up into your Articles panel, that if you want it to be part of an existing article section, then you want to make sure that you see that little gray line. If you don't see that little gray line and you let go, it's going to ask you for another name, right? And so that may or may not be what you want from a reading order standpoint. So the Articles panel is a great way to organize content by simply dragging them into the panel in the order in which you want them to appear. what will happen is in your tags tree inside your PDF, you will see a section or a group with that name that you named it inside your InDesign document. So it makes it much easier when you're trying to reorganize or maybe edit or walk through your tags tree. It allows you to see those labels. They aren't read by a screen reader. They're simply for your information only. But it allows you to sort and group all of this content in the way you want to. All right, let's take a look at another example. Here we have an org chart, and so many times I see people ask me questions about org charts. How do I represent an org chart? How am I supposed to write alt text for an org chart? Well, the answer, it might surprise you, right? Because there are a couple of different ways you can handle this. You can create a list. When you're in Word and you create these org charts inside Word, you really do start with an outline first. You start with a bulleted list and then use the little wizard to generate your org chart, and it's great. Well, why not just take that org chart outline, that set of bullets, and include that in your document so that you're providing alternate content? But sometimes you don't want that list to be seen by the visual user. You just want it there for the accessible person using assistive technology. And there's a way to do that. So stay tuned here. We're going to get to it. I promise you. All right. So the other way we can handle this org chart is by using threads. You could walk through each of the different things in a logical way, right? You could use body copy like we talked about, where you can take that list and start walking through in a paragraph format and say the natural environment is divided into 5 subcategories: land, vegetation, atmospheric, water, and animals. So you can use text to be able to relate that visual information that your org chart is presenting. The other thing you can do is provide alt text, which you could simply say org chart of affected environments divided into 3 categories: environmental, cultural, and project. That could be somewhat accessible. It isn't the best user experience, but it's better than just saying org chart of affected environment, right? The thing you don't want to do is you don't want to use a table to lay out your org chart. That doesn't work. People don't want to, when they're moving left and right, they're listening for associations with columns and rows. And when you use an org chart inside a table, it doesn't relate that same information. Tables are for data, not for org charts, right? The other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to alt text every single box in this. You don't want to create a bunch of little boxes with lines and then have to sit and write alt text for every one of them. That would be kind of ridiculous, right? So hopefully that gives you some ideas of how to handle an org chart. All right, let's move on to the one you've all been waiting for: layering content inside InDesign. All right, so let's take a look at this infographic here. You can see that we have a graphic. Now, above and beyond the color contrast issues going on with this text inside this blue background, we have, it has some labels and some time, and it talks about estimated time of travel, and we've got this text down here, and this all happens to be just one big PNG, right? But we have this table. Let's zoom in here, right? Now, this text happens to be at 9 point because we want this table super small so that we can use it in a layer underneath this infographic, right? So we've got a nice header and we've got some columns and rows, and we have all the same information that was in our original graphic here. We can see it all there. So what do? Well, the easy thing to do is to simply take that table and put it behind, send it to back, and now it's hidden. But that's good when you have a document that only has 1 or 2 pages. What do you do when you've got a 50-page or 100-page or 200-page document and you want to keep these 2 things together? You want to keep them anchored in the flow of text, both of them, right? Because on one hand, you have the visual graphic, the infographic that you've created. On the other hand, you've talked to your boss and he says, look, I don't want this table inside my document. I just want the infographic. And you're telling them, well, but look, it's got to be accessible. Here's the way you do it. This way that I'm about to show you gives you the way to have both items inside your document in the same text flow without you having to constantly chase that image around and make sure that the table stays with that image on that page. Let me show you how to do it. All right, let's look at this other example here. So this is a real world example. We have here this big infographic, and you can see that it is one big giant JPEG, and it's got a bunch of tables nested on top of it. And this document happens to be 97 pages. and a lot going on. So to simply lay these on top when you've got lots of changes and text is flowing from one page to another isn't really going to be the way to go. So what I've done is I've combined all of these three tables into one table that has basically the same data, but in an accessible way. And so like I was talking to you about before, we're going to use a custom anchor to be able to put both of these objects, basically one right on top of the other. So as this text flows, no matter how much text is added or taken away or which page it goes to, these two things stay exactly together. And here's how to do it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to move this graphic out of the way for a moment. And we're going to take our table and we're going to select the table. And I use Control, Alt, and A to select that table. And I'm going to cut it out of this separate box. Now I'm just going to go underneath this figure and put it right where it's supposed to go. This is exactly where you'd want to put the table if it were just the table, right? So how do we get this other graphic to be inline, threaded with everything else? Well, here's how you do it. We're going to delete that box. We're going to take this and we're going to cut it. And that's Control X. And then we're going to go up here in the same spot, which is basically right before where the table was. And we're going to hit paste. Now what happened? You can see that it pushed our table to the next page, which is not what we want at all. So we want to get these two things underneath each other, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here and I'm going to go to Anchored Object and I'm going to go to Options. Now I'm going to change this from inline or above to custom. And then I'm going to take it, and I always like to have mine top left corner. And then the next thing we want to do is keep with top and bottom column boundaries. We want to uncheck that and hit OK. Now what happened? Let's take a look. Now we've got this and that right on top of each other. So the graphic is overlaid right on top of that image. So when we export this out to a PDF, it's going to read the alt text for this graphic first, and then it's going to read the table. So the graphic appears just before the table now in the read order. And so then we can do things with the alt text that we couldn't do before because they're getting the same information from the table that displays what's in the actual image, right? So now our alt text could definitely be something along the lines of graphic representation of table below, or table in the following figure, or table 2.5, or whatever the label is. So this allows us to keep the document flow along with having two different items stacked on top of each other within InDesign so that your document integrity stays together and you're able to provide both an assistive technology experience that's rich and informational and a visual experience that is clean and aesthetic. So let's talk about pattern fills and labels, especially when we're talking about pie charts and bar graphs. That's where you see them most often, but they can appear in just about any kind of infographic. The idea behind adding patterns, because color cannot be the only means of communicating information, the idea of a pattern is to allow us to further clarify the difference between one value and another. And so the same goes with labels. Sometimes there can be such a thing as too much accessibility. As you can see by this pie chart here, we've got a lot going on. We've got 5 different colors and 5 different patterns. We've got some white separation. We've got some labels. They kind of threw everything and the kitchen sink at this one, right? Do we really need all of that? At some point, it becomes a cognitive disability where you have too much going on and it's hard to visually differentiate between one piece and another, right? Let's take a look at another example. Now, this one is from a pie chart that I did a few years ago. The one on the left, you can see I've got some sideways text going on here, and it's sort of accessible. I don't have any spacing in between my pie segments. My color contrast is good, but I don't really have a programmatic association between my legend and the pieces of pie. So I did an okay job, but not a great job. Now, in the next year, I turned around and I really tried to focus on making this pie chart a little better. So I added some white separation in between the different values of the pie. I made sure that all of my text was horizontal, right? And then I added a programmatic association by adding the percentage of the value in the legend as well as the pie chart. So that made that association very clear as to which value belonged to which legend item. So that way I didn't really have to use a pattern fill. Now, had I not done that, I would have not been able to use the same graphic. I would have had to introduce some kind of pattern fill to differentiate one color from another. Just remember, when it comes to pattern fills and line strokes like dots and dashes, there is a tipping point you can reach where you start to stray away from being accessible and you start moving toward cognitive barriers for people who have a hard time interpreting all the different patterns that you might be introducing in your infographic. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this session. I really do love accessibility. And as an accessibility advocate, I'm always looking for new ways to push the envelope of what it means to provide that equal experience for both those using assistive technology and those who are visually digesting the document. All right, guys, thank you so much for sticking with me through this session of A Future Date. Hopefully you've learned some tips and tricks that will push your designs further down the road of accessibility. If you've got some burning questions, stick around for the Q&A. I'll be right here. If not, head on over to our Facebook group, PDF Accessibility, where we're always willing to answer any question you have about document accessibility. Again, my name's Dax Castro. Thank you for sticking with me.